Geopolitical, where we expect the King and Queen Camilla to arrive shortly for the state dinner. President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump hosting the couple tonight. We'll show you live from the White House throughout all the moments from the state dinner as we continue to talk about the special relationship between the United States and the UK. And we'll, of course, go back through the day as well to show you all the pomp and circumstance that occurs when there is a state visit. We want all of you to join us in the conversation this evening. Democrats, dial in at 202-748-8000. Republicans, 202-748-8001. And Independents, 202-748-8002. And UK residents, we would like to hear from you this evening at 202-748-8003. We'll get to your calls here in just a minute, but let me introduce to you tonight our two guests. Laura Beers, who's a history professor at American University and also the author of Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. And we have Jack Royston, who's with us this evening as well, Newsweek Chief Royal Correspondent and host of the Royal Report podcast. Thank you both for being here. Jack Royston, let me begin with you. How important is this state visit for the King and for the UK?
I mean, I really cannot exaggerate at all how important this is. It is probably one of the most important state visits by a British monarch in modern times. There have been some, early in the Queen's reign, particularly to America, but nothing really has the combination of a huge backdrop in terms of foreign policy. Relations between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer have set a very charged tone to this visit. The war in Iran has been kind of hanging over it like a sword of Damocles, but then you also have this whole other strand to it, which is that the Epstein survivors wanted to meet the King and the King had to say no, and so we've had all of that. Then all of that was in play before the shooting at the White House Correspondents Association dinner on Saturday, which created a security dimension. Back home, there have been people calling for it to be cancelled. Initially because, the opposition politicians, a man called Ed Davey from the Liberal Democrats, if people have heard of them, one of the smaller parties in Britain, was saying, do not reward Trump, do not reward Donald Trump with the kind of lavish state visits at a time when he is very regularly taking swipes at Keir Starmer. And then people said, well, now you've got to cancel it because of the security situation. It's too big a risk to our head of state. So it's just got so many dimensions to it that really raise the stakes. And now we've had just today, we've heard King Charles's speech to Congress, and he went so much further than I was expecting him to in addressing some of those really controversial areas. Yeah, we'll dig into that as well this evening. Laura Beers, let me ask you how important this is to the United States, or is it important?
I mean, I think it's an optimistic moment for Britain that this will be the moment when the president thinks that it's important, that the special relationship is important, right? Because recently he's been denigrating that relationship, and particularly in his interactions with Starmer, the British Prime Minister. And the hope, I think, is that his affection for the monarchy, which is well known, and his admiration for the King will help to heal some of those recent rifts between Britain and the United States. And I think it is important to both countries, but I think we have to admit that right now it is more important to Britain that rift is healed.
And why? Why is it more important to Britain?
Because Britain's going to run out of jet fuel if somebody doesn't do something, and then people won't be able to go on their summer holidays. And no matter how serious the actual core issues are in international relations at the moment, stop British people from flying to overseas for their summer holidays, and all hell will break loose, basically. So yeah, the economic situation for Britain is extremely serious. We are one of the countries that's going to be the worst affected if the strait is not properly reopened. And that means that Keir Starmer is going to have to think really carefully about how he avoids the buck stopping with him. I mean, he didn't start the war, and he would always say that he took the right decision, and that the only way that situation would have played out well for Britain is if the war simply did not happen. But he may have a hard time convincing people. Just to give you another example, of how serious it could get. They are looking at their CO2 reserves, because who knew that you need CO2 to make beer? I mean, if Britain runs out of beer, then you can expect full civil revolt.
Yeah. Laura Beers, would you agree?
I would, but I think it's, I mean, jesting aside, the summer holidays, and I have 2 British children and a British husband, and I'm very conscious I had plans to take a summer holiday from the UK, how they could be impacted in terms of flights, but also in terms of natural gas, which is imported, and and the price of natural gas, and people have already seen it in their fuel bills, in their hot water bills. I mean, the cost of living in an economy that's already in very precarious shape and very exposed to the global economy, very much very exposed to Trump's tariffs and their on and off. I mean, I think kind of getting things on a more even and positive keel between Britain and the United States is crucial for a very fragile government and a very fragile economy. I mean, today, Keir Starmer survived what could have been a very dangerous threat to his leadership in terms of a vote into potentially setting up a commission to look into what he did or did not know about Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. But he's not out of the woods in terms of his popularity rating is down in the teens, I think, isn't it, at the moment? And so he needs something to break right for him, and hopefully the king will be able to deliver a win.
As we are talking, our viewers are seeing at the South Portico entrance of the White House, the color guard there, the military dressed, and they look like they are coming to attention. Flags have been raised, and they look ready for the arrival of the king and the queen. Typically, the king and the head of state and the spouse will arrive at the North Portico at the White House. Today it's at the South Portico. Is that different, do you think, because it's the king and the queen?
It could well be. I mean, if they think that Donald Trump pays a huge amount of attention to these kinds of details, and he spent a long time talking, when he was invited for the state dinner, for the state visit to Windsor, he spent a lot of time talking about the fact that it was in Windsor rather than Buckingham Palace. So he really, he keeps very on top of all of these kinds of details. So yeah, I mean, it might well be.
And the pool is showing those folks that are taking their broadcast tonight, the place marks where the president will stand, the first lady will stand. You can see them, they're pulling the camera out now, and where the king and the queen will stand as well. A lot of preparation goes into any state visit. For the king and the queen, I imagine the protocol that is required. Can you speak about that? Must be even more intense.
You've got to remember that they did a whole review of the program from a security perspective after the shooting on Saturday.
The intelligence community of the UK.
Both. So they had talks. There was a period when actually there was a genuine possibility that it might get cancelled. We were told that talks were ongoing and that it was being reviewed, and it was several hours before we then got confirmation that it wasn't going to be cancelled and that it would go ahead. So they went through everything, and they did make some tweaks. They never told us what those tweaks were going to be, but they did make some small changes. So they will have got, they do recce's, they fly out in advance, they do recce's, they look at absolutely everything. But this particular state visit has that security dimension to it, which means that every single step in the choreography will have been gone over again and again and again.
Beyond the security protocol, though, there is the protocol of how you address a king and a queen.
They're more relaxed about it than you might think. But yeah,
Right.
I tend to think that protocol is best viewed as a bit of fun, because that's part of what we like about the royals, is that they have these rules and that they have these conventions. Actually, if you break those rules, the royals don't actually mind that much. It's not that the protocol doesn't exist. It's simply that, for example, both sides have had these kinds of experiences. You have Michelle Obama hugs the Queen, but the Queen didn't mind and hugged her back. There was a big hoo-ha because people felt that Donald Trump had stepped in front of the Queen at some point, and again, she didn't mind at all. And there was even at one point when people got very exercised because Joe Biden didn't take off his sunglasses when he met the Queen at Windsor Castle. And that's an etiquette thing, probably more than royal protocol. It's kind of more general etiquette that if you're meeting someone for the first time, you take off your sunglasses.
And what about addressing the king and the queen this evening, as the president and the first lady have already done today? for those that are attending the state dinner?
Well,
how do they address?
It's Your Majesty on first meeting, and then Sir from then on, if you want to do it in the way that it's done in Britain. But again, if somebody doesn't know that, if somebody's worried because they just turned up and said, "Hi Chaz, how are you doing?" then they should rest assured that the King won't be offended. But yeah, if you want to do it the proper way, then you say, the first reference is Your Majesty, and it then becomes Sir after that.
And bowing?
Yeah, you can bow, but they do handshake too. Some people, there was a point when the New Zealand rugby team all decided to simultaneously hug, I think it was the women's rugby team, all hugged Charles at the same time. And they were not sent to the Tower. So yeah, I mean, the formal way to do it would be to bow or curtsy for women. But they're very relaxed about these things these days.
Laura Beers, what are you looking for in tonight's dinner? What are you watching for?
I think peace and calm, right? We don't know what happened. We know what happened with the King and Queen's arrival, and with the quite charming speech that President Trump made, talking about his mother's affection for the monarchy. But we don't know what happened behind closed doors. We know that there was a bit more bite than maybe some would have anticipated in Charles's remarks before the joint session of Congress, and we have to hope that no feathers were ruffled. We heard a lot of applause. It seemed to be a success, but we also know that there's some prickly egos in the room, right? That things are jovial, that there are no kind of mishaps that, as you say, are probably more likely to be made a big deal of by the press than by the monarchs themselves. But that things go smoothly tonight, I think, is what everyone is hoping for.
And what about you, Jack Royston? What are you watching for at the dinner tonight?
So we are expecting Charles to say some words. We think it's going to be much more kind of light-hearted and jovial and low-key. There was actually it was supposed to be a 20-minute speech. It was a half-an-hour speech, probably partly because of all the standing ovations in Congress earlier. It was long. It was very formal. It was read. We're expecting the speech at the banquet to be much more light-hearted and informal, but I am still going to be keeping an eye out for more of those similar sorts of references and what the reaction is like in the room. Obviously, the president wasn't there in Congress. And also the body language. Sometimes the B-roll is actually the most interesting stuff, which is great for us because that's what we're going to be looking at. But there was a really interesting moment in Windsor during the state visit there and it was outside the banquet, I believe, and Camilla, the Queen, was talking to Melania, and Kate came and joined them, the Princess of Wales. And they spoke for a little bit, and then at some point you could kind of detect that Camilla wanted to return to her solo conversation with the First Lady, and so she kind of beckoned Kate to leave. And it was really interesting because I think it reflected a genuine warmth, that the Queen wanted her conversation with the First Lady, and she didn't want it being, the attention being taken away from her. So we look for these moments. It's almost great in a way when public figures have a moment when the mask slips a little bit because you get to see how they really feel about things.
Besides the politics, of course, how much attention will be paid to what Queen Camilla is wearing and the First Lady, how they have dressed for this state visit?
Yes, there may well be some messages, some subtle messages communicated via the outfits. Camilla, probably there isn't quite as much attention on her outfit as the Princess of Wales. The Princess of Wales gets an enormous amount of attention on everything she wears. Historically, the Queen, people have been, following slightly less closely, but also, it will be very interesting to see which direction she does go in, what the designer is. Will she choose a British designer or an American one? It's, often they, when traveling, do choose a designer from the country they're visiting. And because this is a banquet, the jewellery will also be another thing to look out for. What will she be wearing?
Laura Beers, Jack Royston was alluding to this, but in the past, some royals have sent some messages with what they were wearing when they have visited the United States. Put this in perspective and why choose dress to send a message?
I think that there's probably going to be little gloves off overt messaging, right? I think that the messaging that we saw, Jack and I were speaking beforehand, and both of us thought in some ways it was much less subtle than we had thought it would be, but it was still arguably fairly subtle messaging, right? And I think that's going to be the way to send cues, and I think the cues that we're likely to see in terms of of the royals' dress are probably going to be ones of affinity, maybe as a wearing at least something from American designers, maybe colors, though the color coordination is difficult, right, because you have the same red, white, and blue. But something that is showing that affinity and that belief in the persistence of the special relationship at a time when it is under arguably unprecedented strain, right? And so the message is going to be one of, this is still a relationship that's important to us, and we hope that it's important to you as well at this moment of the 250th anniversary of the U.S. independence from the United Kingdom.
The White House is prepared for the state dinner. The color guard, the military, is standing at attention. The flags are up, and the King and the Queen are set to arrive at the south portico entrance of the White House. After their arrival, we expect them to go inside. We hope to get another glimpse at the royal couple and the president and the first lady when they are inside before they go in to talk to and greet their attendees. And then, of course, there will be the toasts where the King Charles III, and President Trump will toast each other and the countries and this special relationship. Any moment now, we will see the King and the Queen arrive, and we will then stop talking here so we can give you unfiltered coverage of their arrival. Jack Royston, as we wait, what are you anticipating here?
I think that we had the initial arrival on Monday, and we knew that was going to be very simple and very straightforward, and it was, but that was before Charles's speech, and so this is an opportunity to see whether the interaction and the tone changes, and so I think it's one of those situations where body language is going to be really, really key, and my instinct, like I think you said earlier, is that Charles will probably get away with some of the controversial references in his speech. I think Trump will probably just let it slide because he loves Charles and he loves the monarchy, and he knows that America loves the monarchy, or at least many Americans anyway, and certainly many Americans who vote for Trump. So I think he will probably let it slide, but also we do know that he does take some things very personally, and so that this is the first opportunity to really try to test the water and get a kind of test the temperature in the room and see whether things have cooled a little or not.
Laura Beers, folks were watching this joint session, this address to Congress today given by King Charles earlier in the day. They thought that the messaging would be subtle, and it seemed to be pretty direct for a royal, the head of state, the king, I should say. Were you surprised by that? And what did you hear from him?
I mean, I was surprised, frankly. There were moments, I was not really surprised when he, towards the end of the speech, pivoted to talk about the environment, bringing up Teddy Roosevelt and then talking about our environmental legacy, because environmentalism is something that has always been dear to the king's heart, and I think that was something that we could have expected. I was more surprised by how head-on he brought up Ukraine and the importance of the West supporting Ukraine in its conflict with Putin. And
we'll dig into that more. I want to just note that it looks like the band is playing, and they are waiting here for the limousines to arrive. We will watch and listen. King Charles III, Queen Camilla arriving at the White House for the first state dinner.
Shut. Your face. Forward march.
Made a great speech. I was very jealous. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, King Charles III, Queen Camilla have arrived at the White House for the first state dinner and part of the first visit by the King to the United States as His Majesty. We're joined this evening by Laura Beers, who's with American University history professor, as well as Jack Royston, who's Newsweek's chief royal correspondent and host of the Royal Report podcast. Jack Royston, you said you were going to watch body language there. What did you see when they arrived?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I thought we might spend all night trying to dissect what Trump thought of the speech, and the very first thing he did was tell us in his own words. So one thing you can always bank on with Trump is that something unexpected will happen. And he said it was a great speech, so we now know what his approach is to responding to it. I'm sure he's well aware of some of the references that Charles made, but he's choosing to just basically brazen it out, as we would say in the UK. And to just, you know, as with J.D. Vance, who was standing behind Charles clapping throughout, just insist that it was a brilliant speech and not get into the detail of all of the kind of, you know, coded messages that were being delivered. So that's probably, I think Charles will regard that as a win. He doesn't want an argument with Trump. He just wants an opportunity to try to kind of represent Britain and put Britain's side of the story across to Congress and to hopefully be heard by the wider American people and by the president. So I think, you know, Charles is going to be pretty happy with that feedback from earlier today.
Laura Beers, what did you make of the welcome to the White House for the state dinner?
I mean, again, you had we weren't expecting a long speech. It was sort of terse, but as Jack said, he sort of put his, both that he approved of the speech, but also there was a little bit of clear envy, right? He had what Trump did not have during the State of the Union, everyone standing up and clapping throughout his speech, which I think it was a success despite some real barbs in it in terms of kind of putting the best case for Britain forward, I think, and doing it in a way that was really quite charming and with a good bit of humor. And I think Trump recognized that it was a success and was gracious in that initial moment.
Coattails for the president,
of course,
and for the king.
Yeah, white tie. Yeah,
white tie.
Indeed. Yeah, so that is standard for a state banquet of this kind. I actually personally prefer black tie for what it's worth, but it is fairly standard. And yeah, I think Camilla's gone very bright. I think she looks great. I think Melania looks great too. I love her dress as well. So yeah, I mean, I think they're all looking good. Yeah, beyond the fact that actually I personally don't like white tie, but don't tell anyone.
Were you invited?
Well, I refused because of the tie. No, I was not.
All right. Peter Knowles is joining us this evening. He's C-SPAN's Westminster correspondent well after midnight, where he is in England. Peter Knowles, the reaction in the UK and to the King's visit so far. This is day 2. He arrived yesterday, but so far, what are you hearing?
What I'm hearing is a mixed response to the speech, hugely complimentary, but people are hearing 2 different speeches in the one. The simplest hearing of it, the simplest interpretation is that this was incredibly positive for the relationship. We talked about partnership, friendship, kinship, values, all of those positives, and renewal and rededication. So you've got all that theme, and that's clearly what President Trump has heard and what he's responding to. There's a second theme, which is the specifics that your guests have already referred to, which were quite difficult potentially for the White House, because it's the king taking up causes that he's really passionate about: environmentalism, climate change, and Ukraine, amongst others, and really making some quite pointed remarks, which felt, listening to it, to that speech, as though they were responses to things that the king might have come across on Truth Social and in President Trump's speeches.
Peter Knowles, I want to stop you there because the Daily Mail headline is King's Hard Truths to Congress. Is that what you're referencing with Truth Social?
Yes, and there were some quite challenging comments if you chose to listen. I could give you several, but the request to ignore the clarion call, to be more inward-looking. There's the reference to the book of Isaiah and beating swords into plowshares, which the king reversed and said, let's stem the movement to beat plowshares into swords. Now, I wonder how that sounded to the Secretary of State for War. So there were a succession of, and perhaps most striking of all, I should say, America's words carry great meaning and its actions even more. These are quite pointed remarks. They're not offensive in tone, but challenging if you think what they might imply.
Peter Knowles, what do you think this visit does, and has the king accomplished it yet for the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer?
I don't think we'll know until we see President Trump's further remarks as he considers what's been said and the relationship. Initially, very positive. But then if we think back, not that far back, the relations between President Trump and Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, were really very good. It only fell apart on the question of the Iran war. So let's see what emerges over a slightly further time span than just a few hours. And we may get a sense of that from President Trump's remarks at the dinner, because in that case, both men get to make a speech, and that will be really interesting to see how that plays between them. I can't imagine that either of them are going to resist the temptation to talk about no kings and no kings protests. That seems to be on the cards, I would have thought, for perhaps some humour from both of them.
What are you expecting to hear tomorrow during Prime Minister's question? Will the visit be brought up and debated?
Possibly not, because while this has been going on today in a kind of a split screen moment for the news channels, Parliament has been today debating again questions over the Prime Minister's judgment in the vetting process and the appointment process, I should say, of Peter Mandelson as the US ambassador, and then what he said to Parliament subsequently and whether he was entirely truthful about it. Now, the government won the vote in Parliament quite easily today, but another uncomfortable moment. I think it's more likely that that's what the questions will be about, rather than about the state visit. So we've been literally split screen on the news channels all through the day between the two events.
Peter Knowles, before I let you go, King Charles III on his first state visit as UK monarch since the Queen visited in 2007. How significant is this visit?
I think it's very significant. It's significant personally for the King. I mean, he's prepared all his life for these difficult challenges. I mean, it's the longest apprenticeship the world has ever seen, and it's it's a big deal for the UK. I mean, British politicians try to stop using the phrase special relationship because it can get a bit embarrassing if it then appears that the relationship is only special in one direction. But it is important. A good relationship with the United States is simply vital in terms of security, intelligence, trade, you name it, all the things that were name-checked by the King in his speech. And the last few weeks have seen a sort of spiraling downwards of that relationship, ending up at the end of last week with a leaked report that the administration was considering, in a sense, taking sides on the Falkland Islands, but not in Britain's favour. So here, there is a lot of hope that this state visit may offer some respite, at least, from that.
Peter Knowles, C-SPAN's Westminster correspondent, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And of course, we'll be live with PMQ's Prime Minister's Question Time tomorrow morning on C-SPAN 2 at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Jack Royston, what did you hear from Peter Knowles?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, and I couldn't help wonder, as Peter was talking, whether actually Keir Starmer might be the one who bears the brunt of the King's speeches in due course once the King has left. Because obviously, you know, we know Trump loves the King, and he's gone so far in saying how amazing the monarchy is that it would be kind of difficult, I think, for Trump if he suddenly turned on Charles now. But Starmer is a totally different ballgame. And so it could well be actually that maybe in 10 Downing Street they need to get their bulletproof vests on and helmets on and get ready for another couple of barbed comments on Truth Social, perhaps, because yeah, it could well be. I mean, apart from anything else, we know that Charles's speech was written to reflect Foreign Office strategic goals. You know, it was not written purely by him. He chose the phrasing. He chose the wording. There's a couple of things in there that are uncomfortable for Trump that I think probably did come from Charles specifically, but predominantly he has gone through and very carefully ticked off virtually every box on the British foreign policy list beyond the Falklands. The Falklands was the only one he didn't hit. The one that was also quite interesting, though, is that he did get those references to nature and to the ice caps melting in, which I cannot believe was a foreign office priority. So I've got to think that that probably came from Charles himself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we'll see. If I was Starmer, I would be braced for a clapback.
Laura Beers, as Peter Knowles was talking about, this is the longest apprenticeship. This is not the first time that, well, it's the first time as king that Charles has visited the United States, but this is his 20th total visit. He's his first as king. All previous visits were as the Prince of Wales. Do you think he's been waiting for this moment to arrive here as king?
I mean, I think that he's been waiting for this moment to serve as king, right? And that this is part and parcel of the major responsibilities that come with it. But I think this long apprenticeship as Prince of Wales was a long apprenticeship in being a royal diplomat, effectively, and that he knows, as Jack said, what his job is. He's here to represent Britain and Britain's interest. And, you know, his speech was vetted by the Foreign Office and reflects those priorities, but his priority is also his country, right? He is fundamentally a patriot, and he wants this to go well because he recognizes it's very much in Britain's interest. And I noted at one point in the speech he said, you know, as my prime minister said, and, you know, I mean, Starmer is his prime minister, right? They are His Majesty's ministers, technically. But I think sort of saying, as my prime minister said, identifies him with the government and with the cause of the government in sort of, you know, trying to repair this relationship with Trump. And I think he knows that now that he is the monarch, even more so than as Prince of Wales, it is his responsibility to forward the interest of his nation.
Can I also actually add, I would agree with all of that, and I would just add that Trump has given something to Charles that's really extraordinary, through happenstance, not necessarily deliberately, which is that Charles has, through this relationship, proven that his reign, he's proven the value that the monarchy could deliver post Queen Elizabeth II, and we never imagined that Charles would be at this point so quickly. But he has been able to show the Westminster elite, you know, the political elite in Britain, that the monarchy is still such an incredible force in diplomacy, no matter what conversations might be happening domestically about Andrew and about some of the more difficult subjects for the monarchy, about colonialism recently, or even about Harry and Meghan leaving. But no matter what debates there might be, internationally, the monarchy can deliver like tangible benefits for the country. You know, when the tech deal was signed in 2025, there was a figure. I think it was about 150 billion, and that was connected to Charles's soft power.
And is it just the United States, or is it other countries as well?
I cannot recall a time when there has been such a clear financial connection to that soft power. It's not just the United States, but Trump has kind of, magnified it so many times. It's just so clear that the monarchy, the king, is the jewel in the crown of British foreign policy in relation to its most important alliance. America is by a country mile Britain's most important alliance. We've had the Queen in the past. In fact, all the royals were paraded around Europe during Brexit. They sent them on all these diplomatic missions to warm up European countries. But it was so much softer and it was so much less explicit. Whereas that tech deal that Keir Starmer signed the second day of the state visit, so Charles worked his magic on day one. Day two, Keir Starmer was sat there next to Donald Trump signing a deal that had a financial value of about $150 billion. That's been suspended, or parts of it have been suspended since. But it doesn't actually matter for Charles beyond his own care for the fate of his own country. But he had already proven the value that he can provide. And before the Queen passed away, people would opinion polls would regularly say that the British public would prefer to skip Charles and go straight to William. People did not expect the king to be this successful this quickly.
We're learning some details about tonight's dinner from the First Lady's office. They've put out the menu, the first course, and I just want to have our guests take a look at the menu as well on the screen. Garden vegetable, second course is a ravioli, the third course fish, and then the dessert, of course. What do you make of what they're serving the king and the queen?
I think the noting the dessert has the White House honey, which was also a gift that was given then to Camilla by the First Lady, and I think picks up on this acknowledgement of the king's environmentalism, his belief in nature and the climate, and our obligation to try to preserve that heritage. And so I think that there is some symbolism again being played out with incorporating that White House honey into the dessert. I think it's sort of showcasing American wines and the breadth of the United States. It's Trump sometimes gets flack for having kind of basic taste buds, but he's got his Dover soul in there.
Will there be Diet Coke? Maybe there'll be some Diet Coke on the table.
I would have elected for Diet Coke if I were sitting there. But I think it's sort of saying this is what America has to offer, right? This is what we can bring to the table as produce, as well as an economic and military superpower.
And of course, they're pairing the dinner with wine tonight as well. Hopkins Riesling Heritage 2024, Hopkins Vineyards. You also have a Pinot Noir, and then the Newton Chardonnay Unfiltered 2022 from Newton Vineyard. I assume these are American, all American wines. What do you make of the wine and the menu
Well, this
tonight?
is obviously something that America can do that Britain is not quite as good at. We're,
Though
we
with
do
global
have wine.
warming, you have
It's
more and
starting to
more
happen.
wine.
It's starting to happen for us, but it's not quite as good a tour as these tipples. But yeah, this is absolutely also something that the royals love to do when they, when they have a state visit, when they're hosting. They will often do meat or food that's caught on the royal estates, caught up at Balmoral, salmon or fish that's fished on their own estates. Now, the White House may not have this big expansive forest in which you can go and shoot grouse, but they do have their honey, which is fantastic. But my real question is, they should have let us try the wine, shouldn't they? They should have sent us a couple of bottles, and then we'd be able to talk about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. We want our viewers to join us in the conversation this evening as well, and we'll start taking your questions here shortly. Democrats dial in at 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. UK residents. We have a line for you tonight at 202-748-8003. It's quite late in the UK, so I wonder, do you think people will stay up and watch?
I would hope so. My wife has gone to bed, so she won't be calling out, I'm afraid. But I would certainly hope they will.
And why? Why do you think that? Do you think the majority of the population in the UK and the territories will be watching this interaction?
I think there is a degree of cynicism in Britain at the moment about the Trump administration, which transcends party lines. We had very recently, before the speech, Nigel Farage from Reform UK, which is, you know, the further to the right of British politics, to the right of the Conservative Party, saying that King Charles should take up the issue with the Falkland Islands with Trump after, you know, this report about the Pentagon memo. And if you get to the point where Reform UK, which is basically kind of the MAGA of Britain, is saying that Charles needs to take on the president, then really that is the entire political spectrum. So I think that there is I think Britain just really, really would love it if the Strait of Hormuz situation could be resolved. I think people are worried about what summer's going to be like. They're worried about petrol prices. They're worried about grocery prices. You know, I discovered through this whole process that fertilizer, which is obviously needed to grow food, is a byproduct of crude oil. And so all of our food prices are potentially going to go up. People are really hurting from inflation already. And I think people hope against hope that maybe, so, you know, if the king does turn Trump's head, some positivity could come of it, but I just don't think that many people genuinely believe that it's possible. All
right, we are waiting on President Trump, First Lady Melania Trump, along with King Charles III and Queen Camilla to come down the staircase at the White House. This is tradition at state dinners that the four will line up right there on the red carpet on the stairs there and pose for a photo. We understand that we will be able to see that happen this evening. I want to point out on the right of your screen is a new painting at the White House, and for folks who watched that moment on the campaign trail, this is from Butler, Pennsylvania, when there was an assassination attempt on the president after he stood up with Secret Service surrounding him and pumped his fists in the air. We'll continue to watch here live coverage of King Charles III official state visit to the White House and tonight's state dinner. Let's go to Missy, who's in Crossville, Tennessee, a Republican. And Missy, let's hear from you.
Oh, hello. And it's an honor to be on here. And I want to say, if President Trump is watching, I love you, President Trump. I pray for you every day. And my question is for the panel there is, what does King Charles have to do to repair his image with all the controversy that's going on in his family? What's he got to do?
Jack Royster, you want to take that?
Yeah, absolutely, I will. Thank you very much for asking. So one thing to say is that actually King Charles individually is actually pretty popular in Britain at the moment. His polling ratings are upwards of 60% favourability, which is a really solid position for him to be in. Obviously, the 90s was a difficult era for the king, and his popularity sunk during the period when he got divorced from Princess Diana. So for him to be back up there, north of 60% is very strong for him. But the monarchy as an institution does have some issues that it needs to deal with, and it's a real challenge for him. And part of the reason it's such a challenge is because it's been a very long, slow decline that's been happening for decades, and that kind of glacial decline is very difficult to reverse. And what basically happened was during the 90s and the Diana era, the kind of hardcore monarchists, hardcore royalists of the 80s became softer. They didn't become Republicans. They didn't actually want to abolish the monarchy, but they stopped believing that the monarchy was very important for Britain. And then the turn of the millennium happened. And then we had some jubilees, and then William and Kate's relationship came along, and people became more positive again. But they didn't become hardcore monarchists again. They were soft-core supportive of the monarchy. Then the Harry and Meghan situation blew up, and the Andrew situation blew up, and people have now started going to being Republicans, and that is the king's problem.
All right, let's go to the White House. The president, the first lady, the king and the queen are descending the staircase. President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump leading King Charles III and Queen Camilla to tonight's state dinner. They descended the grand staircase there at the White House, which connects the residence part of the White House with the reception floor for tonight's state dinner. We are live here on the C-SPAN networks with the coverage of King Charles III's visit to the United States, and tonight's dinner is part of his 4-day tour of the United States. We have with us Laura Beers, who's an American University history professor, and Jack Royston, who is Newsweek chief royal correspondent, to talk about the visit by the royal couple. Jack Royston, it began yesterday. They arrived here in Washington. It's a 4-day visit. Walk us through where the king and the queen are going, where they have been, where they're going, and why.
Yeah, so where they've been already it's been very positive in tone. It's been very upbeat. It's going to get more somber tomorrow, but we started off. They arrived at Joint Air Force Base Andrews, and there was then a private tea at the White House. They got to see some of that honey. They went and inspected the White House beehives. One including is shaped like the White House itself. So that was all very lighthearted and warm. You know, it's been very warm. It was a very warm first day. There was then a garden party with the kind of great and the good of, I think, both British and American society came together, and some congressmen got their first opportunity to actually actively take part on the first day. And then today we had some pomp and ceremony in the morning at the White House. There was a kind of formal official welcome. Obviously the informal welcome had already happened, but that was the kind of more military, that's the military parade, followed by, of course, the speech, which we'll be talking about, I think, for generations to come. It will be looked back on, in 20 years' time when there's another state visit, we'll still be talking about this one. Of course, now we have the banquet, which will be a really in-depth private conversation will be possible between Charles and the president. And so if the president does want to say anything discreetly to the king about the speech, this will be his opportunity to do so. There will also be some informal speeches, short speeches, comments from both the king and the president. And then I did mention it's going to get a little more somber. That's because tomorrow the king will go to New York, and they will visit the 9/11 memorial there, and that will be an opportunity to really kind of mark this extraordinary and deeply tragic event 25 years on. So that, they're going to meet some people who lived through that. So I expect there will be some very moving stories. And obviously 9/11 was mentioned in Charles's speech, so that kind of fits quite nicely. That was actually the point when he mentioned NATO, which was one of the most controversial parts of the speech, and he mentioned the fact that Article 5 of NATO, or the NATO alliance, has only ever been invoked once, and that was in defense of America in the aftermath of 9/11 when we went to war in Afghanistan.
And then his last day will be in Virginia.
Yes, and I should actually mention there was one thing I missed off on the Wednesday, which is that there's going to be a reception for one of his biggest, most important charities, which is the King's Trust. So that will be it's their 50th year and 10th year of King's Trust International, just a year gone too. So that's going to be a big moment for them. And then Thursday is Virginia, and I don't think Trump's going to go along with him to that. Charles will go off by himself, but it's also an opportunity for him to do some things that maybe matter to him that perhaps Trump might not have put in the schedule. So, for example, he's going to meet, I think, some indigenous communities, which is something the king does like to do. He does it in Canada, for example. When he visits Canada, he always makes sure to speak to indigenous communities there. So that I feel like the pressure will be off by that point. There's none of this kind of big diplomatic backdrop is going to still be in play by the time the Thursday comes around.
And Laura Beers, overarching all of this is the 250th anniversary of America. The king is visiting today. He referenced that in his speech to a joint session of Congress today. It seems to me that this speech is really going to be the event that folks remember from King Charles' visit here.
It has, and I think when we talk about controversial bits from the speech, there were the big players, Ukraine and his referencing of the climate, but there was also a little barb in there at the beginning when he talked about the shared heritage between the US and the UK, even after the revolution and the split, and the enduring role of Magna Carta, and the original Bill of Rights, the 1689 Bill of Rights, after the removal of James II and then William and Mary's coming into place that limited the power of the monarchy. And he emphasized that kind of crucial to both our governments was the checks and balances and the limits on absolute power. And sort of it seemed unnecessary to add that in there, but I think pointed, right? I mean, that this was, Jack mentioned we're probably going to talk about no kings at some point tonight, but I think this was ironically the king's no king's moment, right? I mean, that he was sort of saying that we are both democracies, that we both are based on a system of checks and balances. The king is only here, at the instruction, though it was an instruction put in place, by the previous administration several years ago, but at the instruction of Starmer's government. And had the Starmer government decided that he should not come, this visit would not have gone forward.
And why is that? What is the role there of the king versus the prime minister and the government?
I mean, I think Americans, because our head of government is also our head of state, often find it difficult to wrap their heads around the fact that in the British situation, you have a head of state, a monarch, but that he is not the head of the government, who is the prime minister, who is directly elected by and accountable to the people. And also accountable, he is prima inter pares, he is the first among equals in his cabinet, and he is accountable to his other members of his party that he leads, which when Trump sort of said to him, have my back in Iran, and he said, I have to go back and talk to my cabinet, and Trump was like, wimp, but effectively he does have to talk to his cabinet. There's a system of democratic accountability, and Starmer is that, the head of the government, but they're not one and the same. And so actually the head of state is responsible to the government as well, in the sense of, he travels at the government's instruction around the globe.
You're watching live coverage of King Charles III's first state visit as Majesty here in the United States. We've been live throughout the day, through all the pomp and the ceremony that has occurred. We want to take you back to his arrival on Monday to the United States when he arrived at Joint Base Andrews in Maryland. Here's President Trump greeting him and Queen Camilla at the White House shortly after.
And salute. And salute. Ready, two. Ready, doors. Ready, pop. Ready, open. Doors, ready, close. Ready, shut. Ready, face. Forward march.
From yesterday, President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump greeting King Charles III and Queen Camilla as they arrived their first day here in the United States, part of a 4-day tour by the royal couple, and we are live from the White House this evening for the state dinner. The President, First Lady, the King and Queen have arrived at tonight's reception. We assume greeting their guests, and then they will sit down for dinner, and we will hear from the King and the President when they give toasts later this evening. Up next, we want to show you King Charles at the British Embassy here in Washington yesterday evening at a garden party.
Your Majesty. Thank you. We're so happy to have you. My dear, spoke to Parliament. My great honor. It's going to be great. They're going to love you. It's going to be so well received. It'll be the only bipartisan thing we've done.
Yes.
And his son's a chef.
Lots of things. It's great to see you. Thank you for having me. It's a great
Nice to see you again. This is very short time. I know. A couple of months.
Looking forward to tomorrow.
Yes, very much.
Meet John Freeman.
Hello. How are you? Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
No, I can't believe we're back.
Good journey.
It's always like that.
That was King Charles at the British Embassy here in Washington yesterday for a garden party hosted there. And we are live at the White House this evening for the state dinner. King Charles and Queen Camilla have arrived, greeted by President Trump and First Lady Melania Trump. Their coattails, white tie, ball gowns, the whole 9 yards for tonight's state dinner. Of course, they are featuring American cuisine, American wines, and we have learned that the president and the king have greeted their guests. They are in the reception room where the state dinner is taking place, and so everything is underway. We are here in Washington, in the nation's capital. We're joined this evening by two guests, Laura Beers, American University history professor, and Jack Royston, who's Newsweek's chief royal correspondent. Jack Royston, I just want to start with the garden party yesterday, and there was a no hats bulletin put out. Why?
That is a good question. I mean, personally, I think that I love the fascinators that you tend to get at garden parties, and usually we have them in Britain. You know, the Buckingham Palace garden party that will be taking place later this summer. You can expect to see hats. So that, I think, in a way, perhaps a slight disappointment. It would have been a nice aspect to the fashion. But I thought it was very interesting there also to see in that footage the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, saying, he told Charles then and there, you will be well received. And was that not the truth? Because the standing ovations that Charles got are exceptionally unusual for the monarchy and for British politics. So, I think that will have reassured Charles the day before, knowing everything that he was going to say, to have the Speaker give him that reassurance at the garden party that, that everyone was excited and was going to give him that good reception.
Laura Beers, you also heard the Speaker of the House say to King Charles, it's probably the only bipartisan thing we've done, is have the king before Republicans and Democrats in the chamber.
Yes, I mean, I have to say I have been to the annual, there's a Churchill event at the House every year that Mike Johnson co-host, and there's another bipartisan moment. It's Winston Churchill and the monarchy are things that both Democrats and Republicans can get behind. But it was notable, as I had said earlier, that Trump rarely gets a standing ovation from both sides of the aisle. The king did again and again this afternoon, and I think he will be pleased with how it went. And I think Trump was both proud and maybe a little bit jealous of that.
He did. He said it was a great speech, and he said I was jealous. All right, Michael is in Lorona, West Virginia, an independent. Hi, Michael.
Hello.
What's your question or comment about the King Charles III's visit here to the United States?
Well, it's a shame that they won't be able to make their way to Louisville, Kentucky this weekend for the Kentucky Derby.
I think the Queen would have liked that. What do you think, Jack?
Do you mean Queen Elizabeth II?
Yes,
or Queen Camilla?
yes.
Yeah, Queen Elizabeth II would have loved the Kentucky Derby. I mean, it's probably, I think, the closest thing America has to Ascot, which obviously the Queen adored. So yeah, I would agree 100%, and it would have been real fun to see them both go. So I'm sold.
But as you were saying, this visit represents King Charles.
Yeah,
right.
Indeed.
The stops. They reflect his values and his interests.
Charles is somebody who always makes sure he gets stuff in because he cares deeply. He's a very profoundly philosophical man. He's a thinker, and he has issues that really, really matter to him. And he makes sure that he gets a little bit in there that is personal to him, and he will always have issues that matter to him, and he will always have issues that he wants to talk about. We saw that when him talking about the environment in the speech, which, like I said, I'm sure will not have been on the Foreign Office list of strategic goals. That's his goal. It's what matters to him. And similarly, you know, meeting indigenous communities as well. Like, that is something that Charles would have wanted to make sure that when we're talking about the birth of America as a country, that he is reflecting the indigenous community as well as the rest of America.
Mike is in Conway, South Carolina, on our line for Republicans. Mike, your impressions, your thoughts about King Charles III's state visit?
My impressions have been good so far. I'm just wondering, historically, when the U.S. and the U.K. state visit, what kind of like real policy results and what specific outcomes should Americans expect from this one in the next year or so?
Great question, Mike.
I mean, I think that the point of a state visit is it's supposed to be a moment where they don't take up these policy discussions explicitly, right? So I don't think you're going to see deliverables in the clear sense. Though, as Jack mentioned, when Trump went to the United Kingdom, there was this kind of resulting, maybe not directly resulting, but then consequent tech deal. But I think that the hope is that there'll be a kind of softening of U.S. frustration with the United Kingdom, or maybe a kind of greater understanding of the constraints under which Britain is operating, and that might lead, you know, I think that what Britain would most want would be an end to the conflict in Iran and a reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, but also they don't want to be hit with another round of tariffs at a time when their economy is in a very vulnerable position. And if the outcome of this is that Trump, you know, takes a softer approach to the next round of tariff negotiations with the United Kingdom, I think that will be a win, and the Starmer government will walk away pleased with that result.
Jack Weston, how is this visit different when political leaders visit?
Well, I mean, when political leaders visit, it's all business, and this is supposed to be less so. I think that I would agree with what you said. I think it's about not letting things get worse. There was a past visit by Queen Elizabeth II around about the time of the Suez Crisis, which was back in the 1950s. Britain, France, and Israel made the slightly misguided decision to invade Egypt, I think it was at the time. It led to the demise of Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister of the day. The Queen, in the aftermath, visited America to smooth things over, because we, of course, had not told America what we were planning to do. When politicians visit, it's not that soft power. It's all explicit. It's discussed directly, and that plays really well into Trump's hands, because Trump is fantastic at getting somebody like Keir Starmer in front of a camera and then just, you know, opening fire almost. He did it in Scotland even before relations deteriorated between Trump and Starmer. He visited Scotland. They had a press conference together, and Trump just sat there and, you know, insulted Sadiq Khan and, you know, criticised Sadiq Khan, who's the London mayor. He's a Labour politician, same political party as Starmer. And Trump, you know, the gloves were off, and Starmer just kind of had to sit there and suck it up and say, well, actually, he's a friend of mine, you know. And it didn't stop Trump. So yes, to give a kind of two-pronged answer to your question, with any other politician than Trump, it's probably going to be a little more boring, but it's going to be very directly about policy. But when Trump's involved, the fireworks go off. And so, yeah, it's very, very different indeed.
All right, well, let's continue with King Charles III's visit here to the United States. We showed you moments from his first day, which was Monday, when he touched down in the United States. Earlier today, King Charles III and Queen Camilla were honored this morning with an official arrival ceremony at the White House on the South Lawn, and then President Trump delivered brief remarks.
Thank you very much, everybody. What a beautiful British day this is. And it really is. Your Majesties, members of the British delegation, friends, service members, and distinguished guests, welcome to the beautiful White House. Great honor to have you. Melania and I will never forget the spectacular honor Your Majesties showed us during our extraordinary visit to Windsor Castle last September. Now it is our tremendous privilege to host you, and you're going to have a wonderful short stay, but stay nevertheless. Then you're going over to Congress, and you're going to make a speech that's going to make everybody very envious of that beautiful accent of yours. Very elegant. He's a very elegant man. Here in the shadows of monuments to George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, honoring the British King might seem an ironic beginning to our celebration of 250 years of American independence. But in fact, no tribute could be more appropriate. Long before Americans had a nation or a constitution, we first had a culture, a character, and a creed. Before we ever proclaimed our independence, Americans carried within us the rarest of gifts, moral courage, and it came from a small but mighty kingdom from across the sea. For nearly 2 centuries before the Revolution, this land was settled and forged by men, women, who bore in their souls the blood and noble spirit of the British. Here on a wild and untamed continent, they set loose the ancient English love of liberty and the great Britain's distinctive sense of glory, destiny, and pride. And that's what it is, glory, destiny, and pride. The American patriots who pledged their lives to independence in 1776 were the heirs to this majestic inheritance. Their veins ran with Anglo-Saxon courage. Their hearts beat with an English faith in standing firm for what is right, good, and true. In recent years, we've often heard it said that America is merely an idea, but the cause of freedom did not simply appear as an intellectual invention of 1776. The American founding was the culmination of hundreds of years of thought, struggle, sweat, blood, and sacrifice on both sides of the Atlantic. Fate drew a long arc from the meadow at Runnymede to the streets of Philadelphia that ran through the lives of people born and bred on the British code that no man should be denied either justice or right. American patriots today can sing "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty," only because our colonial ancestors first sang, "God save the King." We see today a living symbol of this centuries-old bond, just a few dozen feet to the left where I stand. There, Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth, an incredible woman who I had the privilege of getting to know. Queen Elizabeth II, very, very special woman who is very greatly missed on both sides of that mighty Atlantic. Long ago planted a young tree. It was a very young and beautiful tree, and look at it now. It's tripled in size and tripled in strength, very much as our nations have even more than tripled. Like our nation itself, it was laid with British hands but grew in American soil. Today it stands tall and proud, reaching ever higher. And this morning it reminds us that the mightiest of trees, like the greatest of nations, must be anchored by the strongest and deepest of roots. In the centuries since we won our independence, Americans have had no closer friends than the British. We share that same root. We speak the same language. We hold the same values. And together our warriors have defended the same extraordinary civilization under twin banners of red, white, and blue. My wonderful mother, Mary MacLeod, was born in Stornoway, Scotland, the Hebrides, and that's what they call very serious Scotland. There's no question about it. Some places they say, well, it wasn't really Scotland. The Hebrides, that's real serious Scotland. That's where they had their greatest of warriors, the greatest of warriors. She came to America at 19, met my incredible father. We loved him so much. We all loved him. We loved her. We loved him, Fred. And they were married for 63 years. And excuse me, if you don't mind. That's a record we won't be able to match, darling. I'm sorry. Just not going to work out that way. We'll do well, but we're not going to do that well. 63 years. And my mother, I just see it so clearly. She loved, and I told the king this, she loved the royal family, and she loved the queen. And anytime the queen was involved in a ceremony or anything, my mother would be glued to the television, and she'd say, look, Donald, look how beautiful that is. She really did love the family, but I also remember her saying very clearly, Charles, look, young Charles, he's so cute. It's my mother. My mother had a crush on Charles. Can you believe it? Amazing how, I wonder what she's thinking right now. But beneath those beautiful flags, 8 decades ago, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt famously met on a ship in the North Atlantic to outline a vision for the free world after World War II. That understanding of our nation's unique bond and role in history is the essence of our special relationship, and we hope it will always remain that way. The ship where the two great leaders met was called the Prince of Wales, the very title that His Majesty the King held longer than any other individual in British history, and he held it with great pride and respect. It's said that when Prime Minister Churchill first met this future king many decades ago, he was so impressed, he made the statement, he is so young to think so much and so well. And the bust of your great Prime Minister rests proudly again in the Oval Office. We're very proud to bring it back. We brought it back. Throughout His Majesty's life, the world has witnessed that same thoughtfulness which first struck Britain's greatest Prime Minister. His Majesty's intellect, passion, and devotion have been really a blessing to the British people, but not only to his own country, but to the cherished bond between the United States and the United Kingdom. And I am very certain that it will continue that way long into the future. In a few hours, His Majesty will stand in the heart of the United States Capitol as the very first British king ever to address a joint session of the United States Congress. So he's going to be addressing Congress, and I'm going to be watching. I was thinking of going, but they said, I don't know, that might be a step too far. I would love to go. It's not supposed to be protocol, but I would love to be with you. But there, the direct descendant of King George III will speak to the direct successor of the very body that gathered in Independence Hall on July 4th, 1776. If John Adams and George Washington, or the King's fifth great-grandfather, could see that sight, they might be absolutely shocked, but probably only for a moment. Surely they would be delighted that the wounds of war healed into the most cherished friendship. Think of that very, very long ago difficult war, and yet those wounds did indeed heal into the most cherished of friendships, most cherished. They would be moved beyond words to know that the soldiers who once called each other Redcoats and Yankees became the Tommies and the GIs who together saved the free world as brothers in arms and brothers in eternity, and nobody fought better together than us. If they could see us today, our ancestors would surely be filled with awe and pride that the Anglo-American Revolution in human freedom was never, ever extinguished, but carried forward across centuries, across oceans, and across history until it became a fire that lit the entire world. So today we look back on 250 years. Let us remember what has made our countries the two most exceptional nations the world has ever known. And together, let us go forward with even stronger resolve to carry on our sacred devotion to liberty and to the traditions of excellence that have been our shared gift of all mankind. Your Majesties, thank you once again for making this important visit. We are so honored. May God forever bless the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
President Trump from earlier today on the South Lawn of the White House delivering remarks after the official greeting of King Charles III and Queen Camilla. It was day 2 of the royal couple's visit here to the United States and happening now live at the White House, a state dinner. We are joined here on the set this evening by Laura Beers, who's a history professor at American University, and Jack Royston, who is Newsweek's chief royal correspondent. They've been with us to talk about the visit here of King Charles and that speech before Congress earlier today. We'll dig into that as well a little bit. But Laura Beers, I just want to begin with the South Lawn ceremony. How important is that to diplomatic relations?
I think the optics of it are very important, right? I mean, this is the money shot, right? As an image to come out of this event, and it's reassuring, I think, for those who are looking to see that the relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom remains close. You have Trump giving a very complimentary speech, and one that harkens back then to a long history, as he referenced, between the Continental Congress and George III, and to this kind of long tradition and of linkages between the two countries. And I think this was the visual representation of that. And I think it will be reassuring to those in the United Kingdom who want to feel that this breach that has opened up between Trump and Starmer is not fatal. But I think it's also good for Trump, right? I mean, he clearly likes the royal family, but Americans like the royal family. And so he can let some of Charles's popularity here rub off on him at a time when he too has his struggles, as does the government in the UK.
And of course, Jack Royston, the president wanted to have a ceremony that was of equal to and reflective of the welcoming he received when he visited. So how compare this, what we've seen so far, to the Buckingham Palace, official visits that President Trump has been part of?
Well, and it's very interesting that you say visits there, because I was just going to say that actually on the first state visit back in 2019, Trump actually said that, I want to do this. And he said, no one does it better than the British. They're fantastic with the kind of military pageantry. And this was his opportunity to do it, to have a ceremony like that where he could return the favor. Of course, he also, back in 2025, the royals laid on something for him that he didn't get first time round, which was the carriage procession around Windsor. So I suspect that Trump will have taken that away with him and you know, really kind of redoubled his efforts to make sure that he could try to lay on something for the king that he felt was worthy of the kind of pageantry that the royals provide, because Trump clearly really likes it. Back after the first state visit, he said how much it meant to him. And how wonderful he saw this kind of display, and you know, all the perfection of the kind of the way that the soldiers move in total unison, all of the drills that go into making it perfect. And you know, it doesn't necessarily land with everybody, but it really landed with Trump. So I can definitely understand why he wanted to do that again for the king.
And remind our viewers, we began this evening with the question, why is this visit important? Remind our viewers.
Well, look, we have the diplomatic backdrop from the war in Iran, which threatens to crash the UK economy. We've already had our growth forecast revised down on the basis of it. We are potentially going to run out of jet fuel soon if something isn't done. That's going to ruin people's summer holidays. We've got inflation off the back of that war. So the hope really is that this state visit will warm up the relationship between Trump and Starmer. Who knows whether that might lead to some kind of progress. You know, Britain really needs this war to stop. There's also, though, some other risks that the relationship could get even worse. For example, because Trump has suggested that the tariff arrangement could be reconsidered. Trump has suggested that, or it has been suggested via a Pentagon memo, that the British sovereignty of the Falkland Islands could be questioned. Now, that is a matter, will be considered a matter of Britain's profound national interest on both sides of the aisle in Britain. And in fact, if anything, particularly among Conservatives, will probably care even more than Liberals about British sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. You know, we went to war over those islands in 1982. So the hope really is for some kind of positive movement on the diplomatic picture using the monarchy's soft power. So, you know, all of the kind of pomp and the pageantry is all hopefully, the hope in Britain is that it will feed into Trump just warming up about Britain, remembering that whatever his personal disagreements with Keir Starmer, the alliance and the partnership transcends those. It dates back to before Starmer was ever in office. It dates back to before Starmer was born. And it will continue after he leaves office, and indeed after all of us are no longer of this earth.
Well, it's called the special relationship, Laura Beers, and why is that?
I mean, the special relationship, we think of it as lasting time immemorial, but really only dates back to Winston Churchill, who coined the term during the Second World War. Churchill himself came multiple times until Netanyahu's most recent joint address to Congress. He was the foreign official who had addressed Congress the most times at 3. But he had this idea. His mother was American, his father was British. He saw himself as having a foot in both cultures, and he saw that relationship. He wrote famously a book called The History of the English-Speaking Peoples about the United States and the history of Britain, and its kind of entangled relationship, and he believed deeply that it was a special relationship.
And we'll talk more about that. Right now, we are live here on C-SPAN and C-SPAN 2 with coverage of King Charles III's official visit here, first visit to the United States. We're going to say goodnight to our C-SPAN 2 viewers, and we will bring you live coverage on C-SPAN 2 of the California gubernatorial debate. Here on C-SPAN, we are going to stick with our coverage of the state dinner. The attendees have gathered in the East Room at the White House. And the president earlier this evening welcomed King Charles and Queen Camilla to the White House for tonight's state dinner. They were dressed in white tie, the men coattails this evening. The First Lady's attire, a pale delphinium pink silk strapless gown by Christian Dior. And the Queen was wearing a deep pink Fiona Clare evening gown and an amethyst and diamond necklace gifted by a former Duchess of Kent to Queen Victoria and then passed to Queen Mary. Jack Royston, is there symbolism there in what the Queen was wearing?
Well, I think predominantly just the jewellery, shows the deep history of the monarchy, and Queen Mary's jewellery collection is delved into almost as often as Queen Elizabeth II's, and it's wonderful to see this piece get announcing at such an important occasion.
It's beautiful. I mean, it's a striking piece. I mean, how much jewelry? It seems like whenever there is some sort of royal event, you see the queen or the princess will wear jewelry from the collection of the Majesty. I mean, what are we talking about here, and why is that an important piece of what they're wearing for the evening?
Well, it's particularly important for the banquets because you don't necessarily get that during daytime events, but when it's a state banquet, when it's an evening event, that is when you can bring out the jewelry. It's also when you sometimes get tiaras. Tiaras are never worn in the daytime. They're only worn at state dinners. So we don't have Camilla in a tiara today. I don't know why that is, but perhaps maybe traveling with them is a little more tricky. But it is, like you say, it's an opportunity for them to showcase these items, one by one, because we don't necessarily see them all the time. You can't just throw it on. These pieces have to be insured often for the specific events that they're taken to. And in fact, when Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, wanted to try on her wedding day tiara, it actually needed a police escort in order to be brought to her. So these are incredibly valuable pieces that actually are part of Britain's national culture.
We're looking at the guests, the attendees in the East Room, and we were watching as Bob Kraft and Justice Kavanaugh were speaking along with Brett Baier. They're all on the guest list tonight. We also have Justice Alito, who's in attendance tonight, along with Senator Barrasso of Wyoming. There is the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in white tie. He is also attending this evening. We have Maria Bartiromo. She's also going to be there this evening. The Treasury Secretary, members of the Cabinet. There is Justice Kavanaugh on your screen right now. Amy, Brett Baier's wife, Amy Baier, there as well. Who from the UK side is in attendance tonight? Who's traveling with the King?
Well, the King, of course, travelled with his private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, who you might see about the place somewhere. I cannot see him in this image.
There's Howard Lutnick.
But so Clive Alderton is the King's most senior aide. A private secretary isn't a secretary in the traditional sense. It's more like a chief of staff. And so he will have been, going over that speech with the King line by line by line. As much as the Foreign Office would have played a role, Sir Clive would have played an absolutely crucial role in the drafting of that speech. And of course, he has his wider press team who have such an important role in the kind of choreography and managing the media on these events. You probably are less likely to see them on your screen, but they will, of course, be there behind the scenes.
And why is that? Because we were seeing Interior Secretary Doug Burgum, we were seeing Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary. We were seeing members of the President's cabinet. But why is the...
Well, you might see Sir Clive Alderton, you may well. It's not impossible you may see someone from the press office, but predominantly they tend to keep, they will not necessarily be guests front and centre. You might see Yvette Cooper, the British Foreign Secretary, and she obviously will, she's been fairly in the background actually, but is such a crucial part of this, because obviously Keir Starmer is not here. Or in fact, there's Tobin, Andrew, the King's press spokesperson, that you can see his corner of his glasses.
Okay, good eyes by you.
Yes, you will get to see a couple of his team then. And Yvette Cooper has been in the background. She has not been hogging the limelight. She's not been jumping in front of the camera, perhaps no doubt knowing that her government is not particularly popular in the White House at the moment. But of course, she is such an important figure in this because of what Britain hopes to get out of this visit. All
right. We also see from the guest list that the Chief Justice, John Roberts, is attending. We have the Honourable Warren Stevens, American Ambassador to the UK, in Northern Ireland, Justice Clarence Thomas as well in attendance, Tiffany Trump, Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, all the Vice President, of course, and the Second Lady, Usha Vance, along with Steve Witkoff, the Special Envoy to the Middle East as well. So definitely a mix of politics as well as pleasantry here at the dinner tonight.
I was quite surprised, actually, as you were reading that list. that that the conservative Supreme Court justices are all there, but that the liberal Supreme Court justices are not. And I think that when we think about the way in which the king specifically sort of talked about the tradition of an independent judiciary in his speech.
I think that's Tim Cook, by the way, talking to Tim Cook of Apple, who has stepped down, talking with Jared Kushner, it looks like, and of course the Treasury Secretary, Steve Bessent.
Yeah. But I mean, it is this sort of underscoring of how politicized the judiciary is, that you only have conservative Supreme Court justices in attendance at this event.
There is Senate Majority Leader John Thune. He just crossed over the camera. He is also attending the dinner tonight. I didn't see on the list, but I was reading through it quickly. The Speaker of the House, I imagine, is there. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. You have Christopher Ruddy. You have a mix of politicians, cabinet secretaries, CEOs. Is it because of the importance of trade with the two countries that you see the economic, the commerce part of this evening?
Yes, and in fact, some of those tech CEOs were actually, they met the king earlier at the White House. And so Tim Cook was among that delegation, along with, I think we may possibly have seen Mark Zuckerberg, I'm not completely certain. But yeah, Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, so a lot of those big figures from the world of tech who the programs, the software that they're developing with AI is going to have such a seismic impact on planet Earth, on every single one of us. But also King Charles mentioned tech in his speech. That's partly about the tech prosperity deal. Those guys were also at the state visit to Windsor, so they travelled to Britain. They were at the banquet then. Tim Cook, in fact, I distinctly remember walking through, so this is not their first rodeo. And they were a part of that. They pledged some of the money that contributed to that 150 billion pound figure that the tech prosperity deal represented. So.
The king mentioning artificial intelligence, quantitative computing during his speech. It was interesting that he brought up technology in his remarks to the members of Congress. And you heard the president earlier in the day say, I'm going to be watching this speech. He told the king, I'm going to be watching. And he said, I really want to go, but that's not protocol for him to be attending this address to Congress that the king gave earlier today. Do we know why not? I mean, why couldn't he go?
Well, I think that the events of last weekend underscore the risk when you bring together too many top-ranking officials, right? And the State of the Union, I mean, King Charles began with this joke about how they always sort of take a hostage when he speaks to Parliament of one of their MPs to ensure that he comes back. But we have the tradition in the State of the Union that one of the members of the cabinet is always held back, just in case for security reasons. But I think, even if it wasn't protocol before, the reasons why are kind of probably underscored in these events. But it's also about a separation of powers, right? This is a moment when it's an address to the full Congress, the House and the Senate, and it's an address to Congress as opposed to the executive, which is a separate event. I mean, here you're seeing a mingling of congressional and executive and judicial officials, and these tech CEOs who I think, the policy of taxation towards tech companies is also something, Britain's proposed taxation of offshore tech companies is a real dispute between Britain and the United States right now, and is something that Trump has been threatening retaliatory tariffs on the United Kingdom if they go ahead with. So I think there's a certain political messaging about the guest list there as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that was the background to Trump suspending this tech prosperity deal, along with Britain's efforts to regulate.
Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch as well there this evening. Go ahead, finish your thought.
Indeed, the Britain's role in trying to actually regulate, and obviously there's been a bit of an argument between Keir Starmer and Elon Musk over over X's AI platform Grok. So yes, it is a huge bone of contention between Britain and America, and that means that that tech industry, those AI companies, all fall within the Foreign Office's core foreign policy goals out of this visit. So it's very interesting to see, it would be very interesting to know exactly what was discussed and, whether they did get into all of that controversial stuff.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, the vice president, has taken his seat at tonight's state dinner. The view that you were getting before, we were able to spy, in addition to the Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, to his right was the Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy, and across the table we saw Maria Bartiromo of Fox. She was sitting next to Speaker Mike Johnson. It looks like the waiters are starting to bring out refreshments. I imagine the first course will begin soon. We're waiting right now for President Trump and the First Lady, King Charles III, and Queen Camilla to come out into the East Room and address the crowd. They will deliver toasts, we understand. And Laura Beers, what are you listening for in these remarks tonight by the two gentlemen?
Well, we've had a speech from Trump on the South Lawn. We've had a speech from Charles in Congress. This is a moment where they're going to stand next to each other in each other's company and make what will likely be much briefer and more lighthearted comments, but sort of watching their body language, the extent to which there are jokes about some.
And there is the cue. We will go live inside the East Room at the White House.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and First Lady Melania Trump, accompanied by their Majesties, King Charles III and Queen Camilla.
Thank you very much. Please. This is a great honor, and we welcome Their Majesties King Charles III and Queen Camilla of the United Kingdom to the White House. Very special place, very, very special. And I also want to, before we really begin, I want to congratulate Charles on having made a fantastic speech today at Congress. He got the Democrats to stand. I've never been able to do that. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. They liked him more than they've ever liked any Republican or Democrat, actually. So I just want to thank you and congratulations. It's not an easy thing to do. That's a tough place. It's a true privilege to have you here for this historic state visit. Last fall, Melania and I had the pleasure of visiting Their Majesties at Windsor Castle, a structure that's so beautiful and so long that it never seemed to end. I looked down as a former real estate person, and it just went on forever. And it was built by a gentleman named William the Conqueror in the year 1070. And I asked the king, I said, was he a nice man, William the Conqueror? He said, I tend to doubt it. I don't think so. When they call you William the Conqueror, generally speaking, you're not going to be too nice, but He must have been something, because it was nothing like I've ever seen Windsor Castle. But tonight, in return, we are really doing something that's very special, preparing to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, a big time in our country, very big time. And it's only natural that Americans begin this commemoration by paying tribute to the transcendent bond we share with the nation that Thomas Jefferson himself called our mother country. He used to go around saying, "That's our mother country." How nice. From English towns and Scottish hills, from Welsh mountains and Irish villages, a people unique in history sailed across the mighty Atlantic to settle and civilize this continent in the name of God, King, and country. So beautiful. They called it New England and meant that very, very literally. The first Americans saw themselves as free men carrying the forward and central liberties and ancient rights of the Anglo-Saxons into this new and beautiful world. In the eyes of America's founders, our war of independence was fought not to reject this heritage, but to reclaim it and perfect it. As the founding father, George Mason, wrote, "We claim nothing but the liberty and privileges of Englishmen in the same degree as we had still continued among our brethren when we were in Great Britain." The Declaration of Independence was a miracle for the ages that sparked a far-reaching revolution in self-government and human freedom. But even though the political bonds between the United States and Great Britain were dissolved forever, they thought, on July 4th, 1776, the more powerful strands of memory, culture, and identity proved unbreakable in any conflict and grew into a friendship unlike any other on earth, a very, very special and incredible friendship. Historians have noted that to this day, the distinct regions of the United States still echo with the particular accents, habits, and traditions of the British communities that first settled them centuries ago. The names of half of the original American states refer to members of the British royal family, as do American cities from Charleston to Annapolis, Charlotte to Albany, and even the place where I grew up and actually loved very much, Queens, New York. Who would have thought? But far beyond names and principles, there's something unique and very special that has always united our two people, a certain nobility of spirit and heroic soul. The same audacity that called a small island kingdom to rule the seven seas, and rule them you did, inspired the children of 13 American colonies to explore a great frontier and a very, very dangerous frontier and settle what was known as the Wild, Wild West. The men who planted the American flag on the moon carried them. The same hunger for adventure and achievement as those who raised the Union Jack above Antarctica and first sailed St. George's Cross all around the globe. The American soldiers who crossed the Atlantic to freedom, rescue in 1944 were moved by the same keen sense of righteousness that drove the English Crusaders to the Holy Land 1,000 years ago. The entire world has been uplifted by this distinct and special character we share, this unstoppable daring, this unconquerable courage. It really is. It's unconquerable. And speaking of that, where's Rory McIlroy? Can stand up, Rory, will you please? That was unconquerable courage. That was very good, Rory. I don't know if that helps them talk about how wonderful the speech, but I had to interrupt my speech because I watched that man win a tournament. That was a tough one. Congratulations. Very proud of you. All right, now I'll get back to my speech, Rory, okay? But it was unconquerable courage, this inexhaustible supply of ambition, ingenuity, and resolve. From the trenches of World War I to the beaches of Normandy, from the frozen hills of Korea to the scorching sands of North Africa and the Middle East. And we're doing a little Middle East work right now, two of you might know, and we're doing very well. We have militarily defeated that particular opponent, and we're never going to let that opponent ever, Charles agrees with me, even more than I do, we're never going to let that opponent have a nuclear weapon. They know that, and they've known it right now very powerfully. But our countries have stood together, defiant and triumphant against the forces of communism, fascism, and tyranny. Together we have expanded the reaches of human knowledge and endeavored always to make this world safer, more prosperous, more just, and more free. Ours is a treasured friendship, an eternal bond, and a true story of extraordinary heroism and skill, a lot of skill, tremendous skill. History has known no more powerful force than the combination of American patriotism and British pride. The British Empire that began here in America certainly did not end here. The sons and daughters of the British Isles went on to found more countries and spread more civilization than any nation before. They built an English-speaking world upon which the sun never sets and provided an example to which free people will always turn, that always turn. They have such love and such respect. Today, most of Britain's former colonies have no idea what they truly owe to this towering legacy of law, liberty, and British custom that they were given. We were given that, and it was a great, great gift. Tonight, on the eve of our 250th year of cherished independence, we turn to the sovereign embodiment of our British heritage and say sincerely thank you to our friends, the United Kingdom, for the richest inheritance that any nation has ever given to another. May our two countries stand together forever for liberty, for justice, and for the glory of God. Ladies and gentlemen, I offer a toast to 250 years of American freedom, and very importantly, to a great man, His Majesty, King Charles III. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, First Lady, my wife and I are most grateful to you for your generous hospitality as the United States celebrates this very special anniversary year of the Declaration of Independence. And may I also just start by paying tribute to your own courage and steadfastness, as well as to your security services, for their swift actions on Saturday evening in preventing further injury. My thoughts and sympathies are very much with you, the First Lady, and all those guests for whom this must have been a very upsetting incident. As the words of that famous anthem remind us, this is the land of the free and home of the brave, as your own response demonstrates. What used to be called in the last war in the United Kingdom, keep calm and carry on. I now realize, ladies and gentlemen, to my amazement, that my first visit to this remarkable country was over 50 years ago, and, Mr. President, the golden threads of history and heritage between our lands are also embodied, as you mentioned earlier today, in your own family and your own family story, whose roots trace back to the beautiful landscapes of Britain's Outer Hebrides and continue, as we know, in the great golf courses of the Highlands. I can only imagine the immense pride with which your own dear mother, indeed both your parents, must be looking down on the great office to which you have been elected for a historic second term. And if I may say so, it is a particular pleasure to be back in this wonderful building, the heart of your democracy. On this occasion, I cannot help noticing the readjustments to the East Wing, Mr. President, following your visit to Windsor Castle last year. And I'm sorry to say that we British, of course, made our own small attempt at real estate redevelopment of the White House in 1814. Anyway, I'm so glad we have an important opportunity at this critical time to renew those bonds of history and friendship between our nations and our peoples. 2.5 centuries ago, the United States of America was founded through an audacious and visionary act of self-determination. From the beginning, the American character has been defined by courage, tenacity, and the spirit of adventure. As the direct descendant of King George III, I know this is a nation that never gives up. And my family's history remains reflected in your maps, which read rather like our Christmas card list across the ages. North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and the cities of Charleston, a particular favorite of mine, obviously, Georgetown, and for that matter, Georgia, Annapolis, as you mentioned, and further favorites, Prince William County and Williamsburg. This said, our French friends can feel equally at home with a glance at a map. Indeed, you recently commented, Mr. President, that if it were not for the United States, European countries would be speaking German. Dare I say that if it wasn't for us, you'd be speaking French. Of course, we both love our French cousins greatly, and we three estates are not only bound by our shared values, but by a profound belief that together we are more than the sum of our parts. Out of the fires of a bitter and bloody Revolutionary War, the triumph of the father of this country, George Washington, and his fellow founders, was to forge a democracy founded upon the rights to liberty and the rule of law. The story of Britain and America is one of reconciliation, from adversaries to the closest of allies, not always perhaps following the straightest path. As you said yourself, Mr. President, during your own state visit at Windsor Castle last year, ours is an unbreakable bond of history and heritage, culture and commerce, industry and invention, and we are determined to face the future together. Tonight, we are here to renew an indispensable alliance which has long been a cornerstone of prosperity and security for both British and American citizens. Our people have fought and fallen together in defense of the values we cherish. Across the ocean and from coast to coast, we have traded, innovated, and created together. We've stood together through the best and worst of times. However, the challenges we now face, from those who wish us harm across the world to balancing the risks and opportunities of powerful new technologies, to the threats to the very international rules that have allowed us to trade and have kept power in balance for 80 years, those challenges encourage us to reaffirm tonight the basis on which our partnership has been built. And yes, we have had our moments of difficulty, even in more recent history. When my mother visited in 1957, not the least of her tasks was to help put the special back into our relationship after a crisis in the Middle East. Nearly 70 years on, it is hard to imagine anything like that happening today. But it is not hard to see how important the relationship remains in matters both seen and unseen. My mother's first Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, understood this so well. But then he himself was half American, a tradition of shared transatlantic heritage, which I am pleased to say is alive and well in the White House today. Indeed, such was the closeness that Sir Winston, while staying here in the White House, in those rooms you showed us upstairs, emerged naked from the bathtub to discover the door opening as President Roosevelt came in for a chat. With rapier wit, the President cast aside any embarrassment by declaring that the Prime Minister has nothing to conceal from the President of the United States. This warmth came after testing times between our leaders in the early 1940s. The kinship and friendship of many centuries provided great reassurance to my late grandfather, King George VI, as it did to my late mother. It means every bit as much to me. Of course, my late mother met no fewer than 13 serving presidents, thankfully all of them fully clothed. The first president I had the honor of meeting at the age of 10 in 1959 when he came to Balmoral was President Eisenhower, who had served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces during World War II at a most critical time in the darkest days of the 20th century. American leadership helped rebuild a shattered continent, playing a decisive role as a defender of freedom in Europe. We and I shall never forget that, not least as freedom is again under attack following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today, our partnerships in NATO and AUKUS deepen our technological and military cooperation and ensure that together we can meet the challenges of an increasingly complex and contested world. And speaking of submarine alliances, there was one particular AUKUS predecessor, launched from a UK shipyard in 1944, that served for the majority of her life attached to the 4th Submarine Squadron in Australia, playing a critical role during the war in the Pacific. Her name? HMS Trump. So tonight, Mr. President, I am delighted to present to you, as a personal gift, the original bell which hung on the conning tower of your valiant namesake. May it stand as a testimony to our nation's shared history and shining future. And should you ever need to get hold of us, or just give us a ring. For 250 years, the ingenuity and imagination of the people of the United States have been an inspiration to the world. This land of opportunity has nourished some of humanity's greatest minds, from the industrial age to the space age. So many miracles of the modern world have been and still are invented in America. Indeed, we have followed the voyage of Artemis II, or Artemis II, as my family and I might like to call her, with close attention. Now, I know you have big plans for the moon, Mr. President, but I've actually checked the papers, and I rather suspect it is already part of the Commonwealth, I'm afraid. Ladies and gentlemen, on this week's visit, I look forward to meeting the people and communities of this dynamic country, including celebrating some of the work of my King's Trust, which it has been doing in these communities, helping give young people a chance to succeed across America in this year when we mark 50 years of the Trust. Can you believe it? Every year, millions of Britons journey to this remarkable country to experience its glorious national parks, soaring mountains and ancient forests. From the peaks of the Pacific Northwest to the rugged shores of the Atlantic, from the vast expanses of the West to the sweeping prairies and canyons, the natural beauty of this land is found in every corner. And in sport, in just a few weeks, the United States and Canada will be among those to welcome the world as hosts of the FIFA World Cup. So in one sense, Mr. President, as heads of state, we are joint hosts. We call this game, by the way, football, Mr. President. And I can only say, as the head of state of 5 competing countries, I will be watching the matches closely and with great enthusiasm. After all, we always like favourable odds. So this city, Washington, D.C., is the home of more Shakespeare folios than anywhere in the world. 82 copies are carefully preserved and shared at the Folger Library. And at this time, when the search for peace in the world is more critical than ever, I can only turn to Shakespeare's genius to remind us of the plea for peace spoken by the Duke of Burgundy at the conclusion of Henry V. My speech entreats that I may know why gentle peace should not bless us with her former qualities. Thank you, Mr. President and Mrs. Trump, for your splendid dinner this evening, which, may I say, is a very considerable improvement on the Boston Tea Party. So, whether your cup contains tea, wine, Scotch whiskey, bourbon, or even cola, let us raise our glasses and voices as we toast the past, the present, and the future, thank you, of our 2 proud and allied nations. To the United States and the United Kingdom, God bless both our countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. There's your ball. Great job. That's so beautiful.
Glasses have clanged together this evening. The President, King Charles toasting each other and their respective countries while the attendees stand and clap for the 2 heads of state. We've been live here this evening with coverage here on the C-SPAN networks of King Charles III official first visit as king to the United States. Tonight's state dinner at the White House. It has been a day full of pomp and ceremony here in Washington. Our 2 guests on the set this evening, Laura Beers, who's a history professor at American University, and Jack Royston, who is Newsweek's chief royal correspondent and host of the Royal Report podcast. They've been with us this evening to talk about the visit, the 4-day stop by King Charles III. Laura Beers, let's just begin with those remarks by the 2 leaders. First, President Trump's remarks. What do you make of the politics that were brought into the speech?
I mean, there was a remarkable injection of politics on both sides, starting with Trump's, assertion that Charles shared his determination to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon, which I think probably broadly Britain does, but to sort of put those words in Trump's mouth, or in Charles's mouth, and also, the suggestion that Charles assessed the likelihood of Iran imminently having a nuclear weapon the same way America does is patently inaccurate. But then Charles came and gave it right back, right? I mean, he brought up Ukraine, and we know about his personal relationship with Zelensky and belief in the Ukrainian cause, but he, called on America to back NATO, to back Europe, and to back Ukraine. And so I think the idea that maybe this will all go smoothly might be, we shouldn't count our chickens before they've hatched here. I mean, clearly both of these heads of state have, their head of government, or in that sense, Charles doesn't because he's not the head of the government, but have their own some political agendas that they weren't afraid to put forward in what was meant to be, and was, particularly in the King's case, sort of some very lighthearted and funny opening remarks, and he landed. I did guffaw at one point, but there was some serious political edge to those remarks.
Jack Royston, how do you think UK media responds or reacts to President Trump saying, Charles agrees with me, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon?
Well, there was a loud intake of breath from me, personally, at the point that he said that. And I think this will cause some concern in the UK media and potentially at the palace. Now, the big problem with it is that Trump was not simply putting forward what he considers to be Charles's general view on the out of context question of whether Iran should ever have a nuclear weapon, because obviously, Britain signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The real issue is that Trump is putting forward America's justification for launching the war, because that was what we were all told. Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuclear bomb, so they had to attack. Now, if Britain believed that was true, it's highly likely we probably would have joined America in that attack. Britain clearly does not share that perspective, and Trump has put words in Charles' mouth, appearing to say that he shares America's position on that. Now, it's a huge no-go area. If we talk sometimes about protocol, it's almost interpretable as Trump returning fire after some daring comments from the King in his speech to Congress. But Charles actually handled it very well. I suppose the speech had already been written, so maybe it wasn't a direct consequence. But he made light of the Iran situation himself by talking about Suez, the Suez crisis in the 1950s. And he said that, the Queen had to come and visit America afterwards to undo the damage. And then he said, who can imagine that happening today? Which is a very subtle reference to the Iran context to this very state visit that he is on right now. Now, he got a big laugh for that, and he will probably feel that he has done some work to kind of undo the potential damage of Trump's remarks by just using humor to puncture the kind of anxiety in the air after Trump's comments.
What is the danger in President Trump's remarks, and who feels it in the UK?
So this is the thing to be really, really clear on, is Charles cannot come forward and say, it's not true, that's not what I think. He's not allowed. Like the monarch of the UK cannot just offer his opinion on anything, so he can't tell us what he really thinks. So if Trump has in any way misrepresented, either deliberately or accidentally, what Charles really thinks, or represented what Charles does think in a context that the King is uncomfortable with, there is no possibility of the monarchy repairing that or redressing that, or simply telling people what the truth is, what the reality of his views is, because he's not allowed to express those opinions.
Do you think tomorrow, 7 a.m. Eastern Time, C-SPAN 2 live coverage of Prime Minister's questions, do you think this moment is brought up?
I think there's a very good chance it will, because the way that Prime Minister's questions works is that it's not just the leader of the opposition who gets questions, but also the other opposition parties, one of which is the Liberal Democrats. The leader of the Lib Dems, Ed Davey, has been saying repeatedly since January that this state visit should have been cancelled, and that Britain was simply giving Trump exactly what he wanted in a context where we were going to get nothing in return. So I think there's a very good chance that Ed Davey may well be the person to say to Keir Starmer, can you say something on the King's behalf to correct the record?
There were also lighthearted moments, Laura Beers, as you referenced. The King seemed to get a kick out of one of his lines. He had a very wide smile after he said to the president and those in attendance, dare I say, you may be speaking French if it wasn't for us.
Well, I mean, it was a sort of nice play, I think, on the notion of, you'd all be speaking German if it wasn't for us. And just to put my historian hat on for a bit, there's a wonderful little book that you can buy if you're ever sort of a tourist in London and you go to the Imperial War Museum. That is a book of kind of etiquette and understanding Britain given to GIs in World War II. And it sort of says things like how many pence are in a shilling and how many shillings are in a pound. This is before they switched to a decimalized currency. But it also says things not to say because you'll put your foot in it. And included in those are, do not say, we're here to win the Second World War for you like we won the last one. And do not say, if it wasn't for us, you'd all be speaking German. Right?
Oh my goodness.
And so it was kind of picking up on what has been a kind of sore spot for the better part of a century now in terms of relations between the U.S. and the UK, and who is the junior partner and who is bailing the other one out. And I think he delivered it quite well in kind of turning it around. And back in the day, you owed as much to us as maybe we owed to you in the past century.
Let's see what our viewers think of tonight's state dinner, the remarks that you heard from King Charles and President Trump, as well as the events throughout the day. It began with the South Lawn arrival earlier this morning, and then King Charles made his way across Washington and addressed members of Congress in the House of Representatives chamber. House and Senate members gathering. It was a packed chamber to hear the King deliver his speech, the first since Queen Elizabeth in 1991. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed, that's correct. Yes, so and those are the two. The Queen's was the first. So it's exceptionally rare. I mean, I think it's a huge privilege for Charles, genuinely. There was so much affection for him in that room, but I think it was felt both ways. And it's not necessarily hugely commonplace for the King to get constant standing ovations during his speeches. And in fact, actually, the King was known for making very long speeches that were not necessarily thoroughly listened to, particularly by the media, when he was Prince of Wales, before he became King. And many a speech went by that barely touched the front pages of Britain's newspapers. In fact, there were times when I spoke to people at the palace who kind of privately admitted that he had said some quite big stuff and it had simply been missed. There was one in particular where he backed carbon pricing, which is quite a controversial thing for a royal family member to do, but no one noticed. So to have some of the most important people in the world, both in Congress, but also at the state banquet tonight, hanging off his every word, listening to every line of that speech, is quite an extraordinary position for the King to now be in.
And I'll note, during the King's speech to Congress, we did see C-SPAN cameras were in the room. We did see Senator Bill Cassidy with a notebook out, literally hanging on every word and taking notes as King Charles spoke this evening. So I want to turn to our viewers, and before I do, just note what the president said. He said earlier today that when King Charles arrived at the White House this evening for the state dinner, that the King gave a great speech. He was jealous. Then before the toast, or during the toast by the president, he said it was a fantastic speech. And then he noted that he had Democrats standing. The King had Democrats standing, and he said, "I've never been able to do that." Bruce in Margate City, New Jersey, an independent. Bruce, let's take your question or your comments on King Charles III's visit to the United States.
Hi. I have a lot to say after watching that, to be honest with you. I'm just really thinking about when we're going to get to the point when somebody actually sits this man down, sits all the pretty dinners and all the fancy stuff aside, and really actually gets down to the core things that are going on in America. There's a lot of stuff to that I'd like to say.
So, Bruce, it sounds like you are frustrated that the president is holding a state dinner or focused on that, the pomp and the ceremony, rather than, I assume, kitchen table issues that you'd like him to be focusing on.
Yes, it's more like rubbing it in everybody's face in a way. Like, we all know there's way bigger issues that need to be handled and talked about right now, and he's more. It's like he's almost putting on an act in front of the country for this king. And I got to, by the way, give a huge amount of respect to King Charles and the United Kingdom, just for actually showing America what a real king actually looks like and how he holds himself and represents a country. It's like almost watching him humble Trump it's almost satisfying in a way.
All right, Bruce, with his thoughts in New Jersey, independent caller. Laura Beers, it's interesting to hear from that caller, because it's not just U.S. citizens that are impacted by this current economic situation. You were talking about, UK residents as well impacted by this.
And I think that for the United Kingdom, they see this as serious political work as much as pomp and circumstance. And as we mentioned earlier, Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, is here, and she's staying out of the limelight and letting this be Charles's moment. But there's an agenda here, and it's an agenda that is, to a degree, about bread and butter issues, right? The impact of the war in Iran is global, and it's impacting prices and consumer issues and kitchen table issues here. It is very much more so even in the United Kingdom, which is very much exposed to the global economy to a greater extent than the US that has domestic resources. And so I think that political work is being done by the British delegation here. And so in that sense, in that it's being done in being interlocutors and engaging with this administration, then this administration is involved in political work here as well, not just theater. But it is true, and there was a real concern back in Britain that allowing the king to come here was basically just playing into Trump's sense of theater, right? And that it would be handing Trump a prize on a silver platter to allow him to parade around with the British monarch and play king for a day as well, in a sense, right? And Charles had that quite funny joke about when the World Cup starts, then they'll both be heads of state hosting the World Cup because he is the monarch of Canada as well. But that it gives that kind of publicity win to Trump. But I think that particularly, but not exclusively for the British, this is also a very serious political meeting as well as pageantry and theater.
All right. Ted in Summerfield, North Carolina, independent. Ted, your thoughts this evening?
Well, hello, good evening, and thank you for your coverage the last couple of days. And tonight I have just been amazed at the education and the entertainment value that you three have provided. I have been just amazed at the things that I have learned. And my thoughts were from today about the His Majesty's speech, and I just have not heard a 25, 30-minute speech that was so insightful and connected in such a short amount of time. As I've gotten older, I appreciate history and a good speech, and I just haven't heard a good speech in a long time. And that one today, and his one tonight that you just finished airing, just so he engaged us. He was inspiring. He made us think. The history aspects, the humor. I know he has writers, and you had talked about earlier his assistants helped, but and that you said he had a lot of input himself. But from the British historian aspects that you three have, did you appreciate those remarks tonight as well?
Yes, Ted, thank you for that. Jack Royston, we were talking about the speech before Congress as one of his, could be the speech of his...
He gave the speech of his life. He gave the speech of his life. I mean, he's not a man who was known for giving incredible speeches. The Queen always was. Queen Elizabeth II, her speeches were amazing, and she has a bunch that you can throw in there, including as recently as COVID. Her big, broadcast at the time of the COVID pandemic was up there as one of her greatest speeches. But this speech by the King is probably unrivaled by any other speech he's given, and we will be talking about it for decades to come. So I think your caller is absolutely right that actually it's in a sense kind of surprising, not to be undermining to Charles, that he managed to maintain such focus on everything he said for like half an hour is a long time to be talking.
Yeah, 28 minutes he was talking.
And then he came...
Lots of applause.
Lots of breaks for applause. And there were points when he could barely get a sentence out because of the standing ovation starting up again. But one thing that I think is really interesting about this speech is that there was a moment in the UK-US relationship that really stood out to me, which I think I've mentioned already, which was when Trump went to Scotland and he sat next to Keir Starmer and he called out Steve Khan over and over again, and Starmer looked weak. And Trump does this thing where he gives people a test. Do you have the guts to stand up to me? And he kind of humiliates them publicly to see whether they have the mettle to take him on. And Starmer didn't see it coming because he had previously got on really well with Trump. And what Charles has done here is he's come to the very heart of the US government and of US power on Trump's own terrain, and he has found a way to show him, actually, yes, I do dare. I do have the mettle to talk about all this stuff that I'm not supposed to discuss. I'm going to show you some strength. But he's done it in such a warm, non-confrontational way that he's probably going to get away with it. And it's actually very difficult for Trump to respond to.
What do you think the headlines are tomorrow in the papers, in the UK papers?
So this, what time are we on in Britain now? This will have missed the first editions. It will probably have missed the second editions of the print papers too. So they'll probably headline on the congressional speech.
Okay.
And so it will probably be around all this stuff we've been talking about NATO But if they, when the online, the online editions, I think it's probably Iran is my suspicion.
What the president said, that Charles agrees with me, Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon.
Yes, exactly. That, and yeah, exactly. I mean, they will probably...
I wonder if you see that in quotes. Charles agrees with me.
Yeah. I think that is literally, if he had not said those 4 words, 3 words, then it would have been completely uncontroversial. But those 3 words make it explosive.
John in Rhode Island, Democratic caller.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And I agree with Ted. Thank the 3 of you for your commentary tonight and your historical and political knowledge. It's been very helpful. I just want to say that I think that the King did Sir Winston Churchill proud. I watched both speeches today, and I was floored. And I want to say to our friends in the UK and to the beautiful and strong people of Ukraine, Slava Ukraini and Heroam Slava.
John in Rhode Island, he said he did Sir Winston Churchill proud. What do you think he meant?
I think that it was, in some ways, a very ironic thing to say, because Churchill, who was very much a monarchist and was very loyal to the Queen, he strove to do her proud, and before her father, and he saw himself as serving Britain and the Empire, and the idea that Charles was the one who was doing Churchill proud has a sort of funny irony to it. But I think one of the things that Charles did really effectively is he hit on the kind of cultural and political high spots of a Britain in a kind of very positive sense, right? He ends with Shakespeare, and he ends not just with Shakespeare, but with Henry V, right? And this kind of great moment of the victor of Agincourt. He references in this joking way, talking about him coming out of the tub, Winston Churchill. He started in his speech in Congress with a reference to Oscar Wilde, who my son is actually reading in school right now. But all of these kind of great cultural and political heroes of Charles Dickens. He's worked them in there, and his vision of Britain was a much not softer, because it is a strong, Britain, the Britain that stopped us from speaking French. But it's not the kind of bellicose William the Conqueror that Trump began his own speech this evening with, right? It's not an aggressive or brutal Britain. And the British Empire, particularly in Britain, has been critiqued a lot for its brutality over the centuries. But that warrior Britain in a really kind of, aggressive way that Trump kind of led with and then said, this has given us a warrior ethos here in America, is not the picture of his country that he was presenting, or of his Commonwealth. And indeed, he, at multiple points in this speech tonight, referred to himself as the head of the Commonwealth. And he does that as well in the speech in Congress, too.
I want to show the Daily Mail headline.
You've got it already.
There it is. Charles agrees with me.
You called it.
Did we get it online before they did?
Yeah,
did we
exactly.
say it before they put it up?
So, who gets the Daily Mail?
Well, it's very extensively read throughout Westminster. I mean, it genuinely is, and read in America quite prolifically now too. So I think this it's going to be controversial, and questions may well be asked about whether it was right to come. But I think Charles has done Keir Starmer a huge favour by following Trump's speech with one that I think, punctured some of that anxiety. Certainly to the people in the room. I don't think the people in the room will come away feeling that this is a crisis, but it may play very differently at home, particularly among Britain's politicians.
Well, we will see how it plays at home in the British Parliament tomorrow. Prime Minister's questions time begins 7 a.m. Eastern Time. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, will be taking questions. You can watch it live on C-SPAN 2. Jack Royston is Newsweek's chief royal correspondent, host of the Royal Report podcast. American University's history professor Laura Beers has been with us this evening as well. She's author of Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century, and an author of other British-focused books as well. I want to thank both of you for being here this evening and helping us with this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And for our viewers, we're going to bring you back to earlier today to show you those remarkable remarks given by King Charles III when he addressed Congress earlier today.
Mr. Speaker, Their Majesties King Charles III and Queen Camilla.